All right, so we're in chapter 15 of, we've got chapter 15 and 16 to go on the account of Samson. And on this opening slide, I've got my little picture here of Samson, which is an artistic or just a sketch drawing. And I'm going to say, once again, that Samson probably did not look like this or anything even close to what a lot of the art, and there's a lot of art that you'll see, and most of the art of Samson portrays him as quite a buff specimen of masculinity. But we'll see as we go through this. There are actually some quite fantastic things that Samson actually did. So chapter 15, and we're going to let's read. If you could open your Bibles to chapter 15, and let's read the first 8 verses. And I'm going to invite Karen. Karen, if you're able to turn your sound on. And if you could, chapter 15, the first 8 verses.
Okay. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between 2 tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. Then the Philistines said, Who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. And Samson said unto them, Though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock, Etam.
Okay.
Whoa.
So you'll get the picture here that the Philistine people are a very brutal people. They were pagans to the core, superstitious, and very primitive in how in their dealings with people. So the things that Samson dealt with, he was dealing with a people that were as coarse as they could possibly be, really coarse people. So let's look at these first 8 verses and what happens here. First of all, let's just note, what was the season? In verse 1, we see
it says wheat harvest.
Wheat harvest.
So
yeah. So it was late summer, I take it. So that means it was probably pretty dry, maybe indeed hot. That was the time of year. And then notice in verse 4, how many foxes did Samson manage to catch as he's doing this thing this one evening?
300.
Boy, that's worse than the hunt in England.
Yeah. I think about that. Like, how would a person catch 300 foxes? I can't imagine even catching one on my own. Samson managed to catch 300 foxes, not only catch them, but he caught them, and then he had to collect them, so he had to accumulate not just 100 of them, not 200, but 300 he accumulated. I guess he would have caught them and bound them up, and I mean, where do you find 300 foxes? But nonetheless, a huge population of foxes that he caught. And then what was destroyed in the fire? So remember what the season is. In verse 5, and when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. So he's managed to organize a fair amount of destruction of corn, of the vineyards, and of the olives. So the olives, I guess, the trees. So it must have been a huge fire that was set ablaze with these foxes. He took the 300 of them, put them tail to tail, and put some sort of torch between the foxes, and so they ran off in a fashion, I guess, into the vineyards and into the crops.
I think it means that he set their tails on fire and let them go.
Well, the firebrand is like a torch. So
yes, he put a firebrand. He took a firebrand and lit their tails, and they ran.
Yes. Well, I suspect the tails did burn as well, but it was something that would burn longer than just a tail. Because a tail would burn it. So I think he had a bit of a torch that was attached, and they drug it as they ran. They would drag that with them, and things would catch on fire. Then, verse 6. How did the very brutal Philistines? How did they respond? Verse 6. Then the Philistines said, "Who hath done this?" Samson called it a displeasure. The Philistines said, "Who had done this?" And they answered, "Samson." Now note this, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. So Samson's wife, his father-in-law, figured that Samson wasn't too keen on his daughter, his oldest daughter, gave him to Samson's companion, his friend, which was also a Philistine. And he took Samson's wife. And then so the father-in-law said, well, you can have her sister. What a way of dealing with things. And so the Philistines, their response was, they came and they burnt her, the girl, and her father. Literally, they set them on fire. They just killed them with fire. Brutal, absolutely brutal. And then verse 7 and 8, how did Samson respond? So in verse 7 we read, and Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, so he wasn't happy what they had done to his father-in-law and I guess his wife's sister, yet I will be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Etam. All right, so that now we'll move on.
So he smote them, he killed them also.
Yeah, so we'll read about this. So he smote a number of them, but then he went and did something else. So now in verses 9 to 20, we're going to see 1,000 Philistines come to bind Samson. What did I say? Satan. Come to bind Samson, who kills them all. So let's read verses 9 to 20. And I will ask Lucy. Lucy, are you okay to read verses 9 to 20?
Yes. Okay. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly. And the men of Judah said, why are ye come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up, to do to him as he hath done to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, now, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this that thou hast done unto us? And he said unto them, as they did unto me, so have I done unto them. And they said unto him, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, swear unto me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. And they spake unto him, saying, no, but we will bind thee fast and deliver thee into their hand, but surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. And when he came unto Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand and took it, and slew 1,000 men therewith. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, and called that place Ramath Lehi. And he was sore athirst, and called on the Lord and said, thou hast given this great deliverance into the land of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? But God clave an hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. Wherefore he called the name thereof Enhak Koreh, I don't know, which is in Lehi unto this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Okay, so let's see what happened here. So after the Philistines kill Samson's father-in-law and the daughter of the second daughter of Samson's father-in-law, he responds by killing them. So the ones that killed with fire his father-in-law, he kills them. And then, so how did the Philistines answer the question of the men of Judah in verse 10? And the men of Judah, so these are the people of Samson, these are Israelites, said, why are ye come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up to you, to do as he hath done to us. So the Philistines were on the move now to get Samson, and the men of Judah are afraid of the Philistines, because they are brutal men. Then in verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, now they're trying to remind Samson of the practicalities of the situation when the men of Judah, Samson's people, said, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us, like they're in charge? What is this that thou hast done unto us? Like you've made them mad. And he said unto them, as they did unto me, so have I done unto them. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So that was Samson's response. But the men of Judah were not pleased with the way Samson was carrying on with antagonizing, irritating, and actually causing the Philistines to take action against the men of Judah. So then we see that in verse 12, and they said unto him, that is the men of Judah, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, swear unto me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. So this is the plan now that they're starting to put together, that the men of Judah want to take Samson and want to tie him up, and they want to take him over and give him to the Philistines. And Samson's going to agree to this plan. He just asked the men of Judah to make a promise that you're not going to kill me yourself. Don't attack me yourselves, but it's okay for you to tie me up. And so verse 13, and they spake unto him, saying, no, we won't fall on you, we won't kill you, but we will bind thee fast. So we'll tie you up good and tight, and we will deliver thee into their hand, the Philistines' hands, but surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. All right, so that's the plan. Samson's tied up, and the men of Judah are now going to take Samson over to the Philistines. So verse 14, how was it that Samson could respond? In verse 14, we see, and when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. Notice this. So this is the moment that Samson gets motivated with the Spirit of the Lord to actually do something with strength. And the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that were burnt with fire. So in other words, they were nothing. And his bands loosed from off his hands. So the cords that had tied him up just fell right off. And so now we get into verse 16 or 15, and he found a new jawbone of an ass and put forth his hand and took it and slew 1,000 men therewith. So he took this bone, he's seen this of a jackass, and he used it as a weapon to kill 1,000 Philistine men. Verse 17, and it came to pass when he, actually, I'll just move this over. And it came to pass when he had made an end of, verse 16. Verse 16, as Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. So this is another artistic depiction of the slaughter of 1,000 men that Samson did. And again, I don't think Samson looked anything like this at all. But and it'll become obvious as we go on here why I'm thinking that way. Verse 17, and it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand and called the place Ramath Lehi. That is the jawbone in Lehi. And he was sore athirst. So he was pretty thirsty. Remember what season it was. So it was summer, late summer. It was very hot. He had just done a huge physical exertion. So he was tired and thirsty. And he cast away the jawbone and called, and he said, verse 18, and he was sore athirst and called on the Lord and said, thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant. Now notice this, Samson knows that he did this by the strength of the Lord. So he's got, what we see in verse 18, L-O-R-D, Jehovah God. And this is Samson giving assent that what he had just done, this slaughter, was because of what Jehovah God did in coming upon him. And then he says, and now shall I die for thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. So he was concerned that he was going to literally collapse because of thirst, and then the Philistines could get him. But verse 19, but God clave an hollow place that was in the jaw. And there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again and he revived. So this jawbone that he used to kill all the Philistines, God arranged for water to be in there, sufficient water, if you can imagine. Water came out and quenched his thirst.
I've always wondered about him handling a jawbone, because that would break his Nazarite vow. It was a fresh jawbone.
Well, yeah, he had already broken some of the conditions, because he had already touched the carcass of the lion.
Yeah.
So he has, again, touched something that's dead. It's corruption, something that he shouldn't have touched, really, but he did, and he used it as a weapon. And now he's got water coming out of it to quench his thirst. So that takes us then to the end of chapter 15. And we move now into chapter 16. This is the swan song chapter of Samson, chapter 16. So in this chapter, we'll see why Samson's strength was a puzzle to the Philistines, because it was. And second of all, why did Samson lose his strength when his hair was cut? All right, so let's look at Judges chapter 16, verses 1 to 3. And this is Samson and the Gaza harlot. So Samson's up to some naughty business, some picadillos once again. And Vivian, can I get you to read the 3 verses, chapter 16, verses 1 to 3?
All right. Let me know if people aren't hearing me.
Okay.
Chapter 16, verse 1. Then went Samson to Gaza, and saw there an harlot, and went in unto her. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all the night, saying, In the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gates of the city, and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of an hill that is before Hebron.
Okay, so this is really quite fantastic. So what was the Gazites' plan? This is we hear about Gaza a lot in the news these days. So that's where Samson is. He's down in Gaza, right there on the coast. And their plan, verse 2, so they had heard the folks of Gaza, the Gazites, they were going to wait. They were going to wait for him all night, and they were going to get him in the morning. That was the plan. In verse 3, though, what time did Samson arise to depart?
Midnight.
So Samson foils their plan. He gets up, he lays till midnight, and then he gets up, and this is what he does. He takes the doors of the gate of the city, not just the doors, but he takes the doors of the gate and the posts that go with the doors. And he manages to put them on his shoulders and carries them all the way over to Hebron. And you'll see now how far Hebron is. So this is just a sketch of a depiction of Samson. First of all, I can't imagine. I've done fence repair. David, you've probably repaired a fence or two in your time.
I used to work building fences.
Oh,
So yeah, I'm familiar with the experience of repairing and building fences.
Yeah, and one of the worst things is trying to pull out an existing post. So like when I've tried to pull a post out, they usually, when they're set in the ground, they just sort of lock in. And I've had to use all kinds of tricks to get a post out. And this guy pulls the post out, and then with the doors
of a city gate.
And these aren't just like small doors. It's the city gates. And he puts them on, he manages to carry them. And he goes from Gaza, this is where he goes, from Gaza over to Hebron. That's a distance of 60 kilometers. That's stunning. That's staggering. I mean, I can't imagine any strong man carrying. I mean, even if a strong man could pull the posts and the door off and carry it, I can't imagine them carrying it for 60 kilometers. So here's another depiction of what that might have looked like. Who knows? But I mean, we're talking 60 kilometers. So there's Gaza in the background. There's Samson. So he's going to be going over hill and dale to get over to Hebron with this gate. All right. So that's Samson in Gaza. We move on now to chapter 16, verse 4. Oh, here I have another picture. Yes, another picture of Samson, another depiction of what some artist figured Samson looked like and what the gates look like. All right, now Judges 16, starting at verse 4. And he, Samson, loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. So here we have somebody's idea of what Delilah might have looked like. It's pure fantasy. So map-wise, this red line here in the sort of the center left of this green map is the valley of Sorek. And then you see a red circle here. This is Zorah and Eshtaol. This is where Samson initially primarily moved between these locations. Here, this red arrow pointing down, this is where Lehi is. So this is where the slaughter of 1,000 Philistines happened in this area. Timnath is up here in the north, and this area to the bottom and to the left is the Philistine territory. occupied territory. And this area here is where Israel was found. So there's a corner map here. Here's Hebron is down in the bottom of the map. So you can see where Hebron is. So he's really been all over the place. And this is a sketch that shows it's the Valley of Sorek. And this is where, this is the area in which Delilah lived. And see, this is the Philistine area. This is the Israelite area. And Zorah, Eshtaol, this is sort of the lay of the land. And this is what the portion that the Philistines occupied. Okay. So we're in chapter 16, and let's read now chapter 16. And I think I'm going to stop the reading at, so David, if I could get you to read from verse 4 to 14. Could you do that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Okay, so. And it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords and the Philistines came up unto her and said unto her, entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. And Delilah said to Samson, tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. And Samson said unto her, if they bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak, and be as another man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withs, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now there were men lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber. And she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withs as a thread of a tow is broken. Then it touched, when it toucheth the fire. So his strength was not known. And Delilah said unto Samson, behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, if they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him therewith, and said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber. And he brake them from off his arms like a thread. And Delilah said unto Samson, hitherto thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, if thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. And she fastened it with the pin, and said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awakened out of his sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam, and with the web. And she said unto him, how canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherewith thy great strength lieth.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so here's the situation. Samson's in love with this Philistine woman, Delilah. And from verse 5 and from verse 9, it becomes clear to me that the reason for Samson's strength was not obvious. It could not be seen just looking at him. Ergo, I would say then, Samson did not look like a strong man. I mean, I go to the gym, and there are fellows there that can lift more than their weight. In fact, they can chest press a car engine. And the reason they can chest press hundreds of pounds, just looking at them, is obvious. They're big, strong men. But Samson is doing things like carrying the gates of Gaza all the way 60 kilometers to here, and the Philistines can't figure this out. So they want to know the reason. Where is his strength? And in verse 9, we see the word, so his strength was not known. So that makes it pretty clear to me that Samson probably looked not just like an average man. I would venture to say that Samson probably looked like a 98-pound weakling. He looked like a scrawny guy that by all rights shouldn't be able to tear his way out of a paper bag. But he was amazingly strong at times. So the Philistines were willing to give Delilah money. In fact, a fair amount of money. In verse 5, we see 1,100 pieces of silver. So, I mean, that to me sounds like it was a fair amount of coin. And they wanted to know. And so Delilah was purchased and motivated because she had access now. She could get that 1,100 pieces of silver if she could just figure out, get the information from Samson, what was the strength. And in verse 6, we see the words, she says, pray thee, tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth. So what is the source of your strength? And how could you be bound? So Samson's going to start to give her responses, and these responses are going to be fairly telling, that they are fairly ridiculous responses. But then if he's just an average looking guy, and the Philistines, now remember, if they're superstitious, they're pagan people, so they're going to believe in mystical things. So Samson in verse 7 says, he responds to her, he says, and Samson said unto her, if they buy me with 7 green withs. Now a with is as best as I can tell, it's a small cord. It really is like a string. So if they buy me with a special number 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man. So he gives her an answer which is, sounds ridiculous. How could a string bind anybody? But if Samson himself looks like a 98-pound weakling, then it just makes sense to the Philistines that this is the way to get him, is with something that's not obvious. Tie him up with a string. So verse 8, then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her those 7 green withs which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And then in verse 9, the men were lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber. So they were hiding out of sight. And she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withs as a thread of tow. Now, as best as I can figure out, tow is really some sort of garbage thread, a garbage material that has been made into some sort of a thread. And so he was able to break out of it almost like it didn't even exist. It was just ashes, and it broke away from him. So his strength, so they still, verse 9, the source of his strength was still not known. And then verse 10, and Delilah said unto Samson, behold, thou hast mocked me. You're making a fool of me. And he told me lies. Now tell me, this is the second time now, I pray thee, wherein thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, if they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then shall I be weak and be as another man. So here's another sort of mystical way to tie me up, is with new ropes, something that's never been used on another man. So verse 12, Delilah took the new ropes, bound him therewith, and said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber, and he brake them, he broke those cords off his arms like a thread. Okay, then verse 13. And Delilah said unto Samson, hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Tell me, this is time number 3, wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, now here's another ridiculous response, if thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. So here I've got an artist's depiction of Samson's hair, his 7 locks being woven into the web of a loom. And so he said, if you take my 7 locks and if you weave them into a loom, then I'll be like other men. So verse 14, and she fastened it with a pin and said unto him, all right, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awakened out of his sleep. So evidently he was sleeping while she was weaving his hair into the loom. And he went away with the pin and of the beam and with the web. So he took the whole contraption and got up with it and dealt with the situation. So verse 15. Now, and she said unto him, how canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherewith thy great strength lieth. So let's now read. We'll read verses 16 to 22. And Zenka, could you please read verses 16 to 22?
Yeah, okay. 16. And it came to pass when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death, that he told her all his heart and said unto her, there hath not come a razor upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and brought money in their hand. And she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. Howbeit, the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven.
Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. So here, this is very interesting how this progresses here. So, having been petitioned by Delilah 3 times about the reason for his strength, and he's very sweet on her. So now he capitulates, and he tells her, and by pressing, she presses him daily with her words, and so verse 16, his soul was vexed unto death. So he couldn't take it anymore. So verse 17, he finally collapsed into a confession, and he told Delilah, note the words, all his heart, chapter 16, verse 17. He told all his heart and said unto her about the fact of his being a Nazarite from the womb, and that if he be shaven, his strength would go from him, and he would become weak and be like any other man. And now we're going to see also in this chapter that the Spirit of God actually dwelt with Samson, and this is something that happened in the time of the prophets, the time of David, that the Spirit would come and go. Unlike it is today during the present dispensation, where the believer is permanently indwelt by the Spirit. There is no coming and going. It was David who petitioned the Lord not to take his Holy Spirit away. And Samson, as long as he was following the vow of the Nazarite, the Spirit of God was with him. Not that he could necessarily feel the Spirit all the time, because we also see in these verses that when he went to do something, he didn't know that the Spirit had actually left him. Now he talks about in verse 17 that if I be shaven, then my strength will go for me. So what does shaving have to do? There's nothing superstitious here with shaving. The shaving of the head of a Nazarite or one taking the Nazarite vow indicates that the period of the vow is now complete. It's done. It's over. Paul shaved his head at the conclusion of the time that he was under a vow. So the vow goes from the time it's made until the head is shaved. So if Samson's head were to be shaved, that would be to say that he is no longer under the vow of a Nazarite. That's why his strength would depart. Not also to forget that he had violated the other matters concerning being a Nazarite, which had to do with not touching anything dead or not eating anything of the fruit of the vine. So there were things that were also associated with a Nazarite, but this particular matter of the head being shaved shows that the vow was now complete. So verse 18, and when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, So she could tell that he was being sincere this time. So she got pretty excited. She sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up this once, for he has showed me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought money in their hands. So she had persuaded them that she really knew the deal now, that it had to do with the 7 locks of his hair. So they come up, they've got the money, and they don't make themselves obvious. And in verse 19, she makes him to sleep upon her knee. So there's the guy. He's fallen asleep and asleep on her knee. And then who was it that cut the locks of Samson's hair? So it's very common that most seem to think that it was Delilah that cut the locks of Samson's hair. And here's actually a drawing. This is from medieval times, a drawing. And here's Delilah with shears in her right hand, and in her left hand is one of these 7 locks. And she's cut it off, and she's holding it up, signaling the men who are dressed like knights, because this is medieval, this drawing. And she's showing them that she has cut off the hair. But this is not how it happened. She didn't cut off the hair. Rather, she called, and a man came in, and she caused the man to shave off the 7 locks. So verse 19, and she made him sleep upon her knee, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him. That would be, to afflict him would be to arouse him, like wake up. She began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. So verse 20, we read, and she said, "The Philistines be upon thee, Samson." And he awoke out of his sleep, and he said, "I will go out as at other times," and note this, "and shake myself." And he wist not, it's like he didn't know, he was unaware that the Lord, Jehovah, the Spirit of Jehovah God, was departed from him. So Samson was not sealed. He was one of those, like David, that under certain conditions, the Spirit would depart. And here's a condition: when his hair is cut now and his Nazirite vow is broken, the Spirit is departed. So here's another painting, shows the 7 locks of Samson's hair here on the bed sheets. And Samson is now, he's got short hair, and he's being taken away by the Philistines. All right. There's another depiction. Delilah tells Samson, "The Philistines be upon thee." This is also medieval. You can see how the fellows are dressed here. They've got armory on. They're dressed like knights of armor. And then Samson, verse 21, Samson is taken by the Philistines. And notice how virtually every one of the artists depicts Samson as a strong, physically big, strong man. And that it's taking all these men to try and subdue him. Well, it probably didn't take all these men to subdue him, because with the Spirit of God having left him now, he was probably very easy to manage. Verse 21, and the Philistines took him and put his eyes out. So this is from Rembrandt. And this is Rembrandt's painting, Samson's eye being put out by the Philistines. And there is big Samson laying on the ground. There's you can see that the men here have knights of armor armor on their bodies. Samson is on the ground. He's got a weapon being held to his chest. And I'm going to move to the next picture. You'll see this is a fairly brutal picture painting that was done by Rembrandt. And it looks like over here, this is Delilah. Before I change the picture, in the center, there's a female picture. She's got in her right hand a pair of shears, and in her left hand, she's got the hair, the 7 locks. So even Rembrandt, I guess he didn't take time to really read the account of Samson, because he figured that he would be okay to show Delilah running off with Samson's hair. So here's a close-up view. This is what Rembrandt put together. And so they're putting out Samson's eyes here. They've got the poker stuck in his right eye. Poor Samson. Brutal way to be dealt with. All right, verse 21. Then, and in verse 21, we read, and they brought him down to Gaza. So they put his eyes out first, and then they brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. So this is another very famous painting of Samson. And again, it shows him as has become famously through folklore thought that Samson was this big, strong fellow. And so as a big, strong fellow, they've got him pushing this grinding wheel, this fellow sitting on top, prodding him with a stick, as Samson is then forced to push the grinding mill and grind the grain, where he's got fetters on his ankles, and they're looking at him as he does this work. But all it says in verse 21 is he did grind in the prison house. Now that doesn't say that what kind of grinding he was doing. So this picture here shows, one type of grinding mill. So it's a big wheel, and there's a post and a beam that can be pushed, and the grain can be ground that way. But then the grain could also be ground this way, like it could be child's play. There's a couple of stones, and here's a child turning the stone to grind grain. Or in fact, grain can even be ground with a pestle, mortar and pestle. Yeah. And so the words in verse 21 should not be reason to think that Samson was pushing some great big stone to grind wheat, but that is the persistent image caught by artists. I rather suspect that he was probably doing something a whole lot less physically demanding. Now, verse 22, howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. So here's this is a sketch now of Samson in prison, and he's got the big grinder attached to him. And again, the drawing shows a great big strong Samson. All right, so now let's go and we'll read the remaining verses from verse 23 to 31. And let's see, who we got that hasn't read yet? I think everyone's read. So I think I'll ask Vivian to read, if you will, then verses. So we're coming now up to the very end, verses 23 to 31.
Verse 23. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, suffer me, that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean on them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah, his father. And he judged Israel 20 years.
Okay, thank you, Vivian. All right, so as we move on, verse 26, we see that Samson was being led by a lad. So that's another indication that really Samson was not a fearsome, strong man. They, in fact, made sport of him by having a lad lead him. It didn't take like a team of men with chains around him and ropes around him to guide him. A lad could lead him. And so in verse 26, and Samson said unto the lad that led him by the hand, suffer me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. So Samson is already beginning to contemplate exactly what he's going to do. He has a sense of where he's been taken. He may, in fact, be familiar with the place from days past. And in verse 27, we saw that there were 3,000 men and women that were not just in the building, but they were upon the roof of the building as well. I mean, these structures quite often were flat roof structures, so they had like a balcony. The roof was a balcony, and then the ground floor, stone structures. And in verse 28, Samson calls to the Lord, and he begins by petitioning Jehovah God, and he says to Jehovah God to remember me and strengthen me. So that's where his strength now is going to return. So he makes a request of God to strengthen him this one time only. And then he's requesting, moreover, that he wants to be avenged for what the Philistines have done to him. And so we see here in verse 29, in this painting, and Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand and the other with his left. So here's a painting of Samson. It's again, it's kind of a medieval setting. They look like they're from medieval times as opposed to biblical times. And he's grasping the two pillars. So he, verse 30, he says, "And let me die." Samson, Judges chapter 16, verse 30, "And Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines,' and he bowed himself." Now, I don't like to take issue at all at any time with the King James Bible, but I would actually, and this is just me, but I would prefer to read verse 30 without the italicized words, which read "all his," where we read in verse 30, "And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords." I would actually prefer to read this, and I'll tell you why, that it should be read, "And he bowed himself with might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein." Now, the reason I leave out the words "all his," which have been placed by the translators, is that I'm of the thought Samson, it wasn't his might. It was might that was endued upon him by the Spirit of God, because this was another feat that no physical man could do himself. So Samson, then, I would understand this, that he bowed himself with might, and that might being the source of that being the Holy Spirit, Jehovah God.
Can I mention something? Is that okay?
Sure, David. Yes.
Okie doke. Sometimes in the early modern English of the way that, in how the King James Bible is translated,
yes,
they don't use pronouns the way we do.
Okay.
So what we grammatically would say is I forget the term for it, even though I'm a grammar guy, but
so you want to say
pronoun agreement. That's the
Okay.
term. Pronoun agreement. So just to give you an example, you'll notice when you're reading all through the Bible, you'll see this where it'll say like his or something like that, but you could go, is it referring to one person or the other?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll show you an example in Hebrews 10.
Yes.
Okay, just really quick, even though it's not related to the verse, but I'll give you an example where it says, okay, where does it say in Hebrews 10? Oh yeah, sorry. Verse 29. So, let's say, let's start at verse 28. He that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much sorer punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy? Now look at that word he. Okay, so it's the person committing the sin here. That's who the pronoun is, right?
Yep.
So he be thought worthy, who hath trodden underfoot the Son of God, okay?
Yep.
And hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing. Okay, who's the he when it says wherewith he was sanctified? I'm going to say here that he is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was sanctified.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
You see?
The Son of God. It's the closest antecedent.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So what I'm suggesting is, I think you're correct with all his might, right? And I think the way you want to read it and say like with all might, meaning because you want to acknowledge that it's God's power.
Yeah.
But I want to suggest that all his might, his pronoun is probably all the Lord's might.
Yes. Okay.
Because a lot of times in scripture, I could show other passages where it's like the pronoun, you could go, is it this guy or that guy?
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because early modern English was a little different than how we use it today.
Okay, and yes, I now the way I was reading this, in verse 30, where I read, and he bowed himself and his. So the he and the his I took as all in reference to Samson.
He and himself, you mean, not his might.
He bowed.
Yeah, himself.
Himself.
Right,
he bowed
that's
himself.
Right.
So he bowed his might is the way I was reading it. But David makes a very good point. Anyhow, I think we're not doing violence to the text if we read it without the italicized words, but I think the problem is more my understanding than what the translators have done. But the way I understand this is that the might in this case was all spiritual.
That's what David's saying.
Yeah, so we're in violent agreement.
Yeah.
And the house was violently shaken as a result of what Samson did. And the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. And so here we have now at the end, Samson dies with all of them in this great collapse. And then we go really to the end here, which is in verse 31. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol. If you remember that map, the green map showed where Zorah and Eshtaol is, in the burying place of Manoah, his father, and he judged Israel for 2. So this is actually a picture of what is reputed to be the tomb of Samson and his father. They are said anyhow. If we were to be there, we would be told that this is where Samson is buried,
even if it wasn't.
Even if it's not true, but
because that sells.
Yeah, because everybody wants to see it. All right, then that takes me to my final slide. And my final slide is what I have to say here is that Samson is faulted. He's faulted by biblical scholarship and that say that Samson really achieved nothing, that he wrought no abiding work for Israel and perished in captivity to his enemies, the Philistines. So this is actually a quote from C.I. Scofield, who should know better. That Scofield said that Samson achieved nothing. That's a rather harsh, judgmental touch, because there was something that Samson did that pleased God, and we have scripture to tell us this. So in Hebrews, we were in Hebrews 10, back in Hebrews, and so the verses are here on this slide. Save you the work of having to go look for it. Hebrews 11, verses 32 and 34, 39 and 40, where this chapter is sometimes referred to as the Hall of Faith. And we read, and what shall I say more? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, and of Samson. Notice this. And so Samson is listed here along with David and Samuel and the prophets. Samson's right there with them. And the writer to the Hebrews says, who through faith, notice this, through faith, and faith is believing God, through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in flight, turned to flight the enemies of the aliens. Armies. I got aliens in there. The armies of the aliens. All these having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promises of God. So Samson is included with all of those that had obtained a good report through faith. And then the writer concludes the verse by saying, receive not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So in other words, Samson, along with David and Samuel and Gideon, they're all waiting for the promise. They obtained a good report, but they are waiting yet for the promise for God to set up the kingdom and for them to be resurrected and brought back into the kingdom. And so the writer says that they without us should not be made perfect. So they have to wait for everybody else, and then together they will be made, brought back to the to life. They're resurrected and brought perfect into the kingdom. So that concludes my study in Samson. I hope you caught a few additional things there that haven't been said before. And with that, we'll end the recording.